I'm 84, and my hands have been hurting since I was 63 years old. That's 21 years of mornings where the very first thing I felt, before the coffee, before the birds, before I had any say in how the day was going to start, was the ache in my knuckles. That familiar bone-deep stiffness that told me without any drama exactly how long I'd been alive. For 9 of those years, I did precisely what the doctor told me. Took the little orange pills, refilled the prescription, made the appointment, went back and had the same conversation that ended the same way. I managed. I've written some of this down. It's all in the Coleman Remedy book. Links right there in the description. But what I want to tell you today starts before that book, before I knew a single thing that's in it. If something about what I just said sounds like your morning, I'd be grateful if you stayed. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who sat at his own kitchen table, wondering whether managing was the best it was ever going to get. That's what the comments are for. And if you want to make sure you don't miss what comes next, there's a subscribe button on this page. And Patricia tells me people push it. I'd be glad if you did. The year they first diagnosed it, 1987, I was 46 years old. I drove home from that appointment with a prescription on the seat beside me, and something I couldn't quite name sitting in my chest. Relief, I think, or the closest thing to it. They'd put a word to what was happening. Osteoarthritis. Said it was common. Said it was manageable. Shook my hand at the door like a man closing a deal. And that was the end of the conversation. I drove back along Route 19, past the ridge where Eleanor always wanted to stop in October to watch the leaves come off the maples. And I thought, well, at least now I know. At least there's something to take for it. I'd grown up in a house where you didn't see a doctor unless something was broken or bleeding. My daddy Earl managed his entire life that way. A morning tonic he made himself, what grew in the garden or along the fence line, and what he'd written down in that old notebook of his. 200 pages in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who didn't waste words or paper. But I was a modern man by then. I had an engineering degree and 30 years of working for an institution that built things meant to last. I believed in proper channels. I believed in the system, the way you do when you've spent a career inside one and it's mostly behaved itself. So I filled the prescription, and the next one, and the ones after that. For a while it seemed like it was working, or more precisely, I stopped expecting my hands to feel good and started expecting them to feel less bad. That's a slow drift. You don't notice it while it's happening. Every morning I take stock of the pain, the way you take stock of the weather. Not hoping for sunshine, just calculating what you could still do. You adjust accordingly, and you call it managing. And eventually you forget there was ever another word for it. Eleanor watched this without saying much. She was a nurse for 28 years, and she understood more about what those pills were doing inside me than I ever cared to know. But Eleanor also understood something that most people don't, that a man can't be told into a realization. He has to arrive at it by his own route, on his own schedule. And the best thing you can do is make sure he knows the door's there when he gets to it. That was her particular gift. It served her well with patients, and it served her well with me. I kept the pill bottle on the left side of the kitchen counter, right next to the coffee maker. Same spot every morning for 9 years. Up at 5:30, kettle on, pill, garden. That was the order. The pill had become as invisible as the coffee, as the boots at the door, as the particular creak of the back step I still haven't fixed. When something becomes invisible, you've stopped asking whether it belongs there. What I wasn't asking, what sat quiet in the back of my mind for 9 straight years, like a toolbox I kept meaning to sort through, was a simple question. Not, are you managing? I was managing fine. The question was, are you getting better? Is something in there actually healing? Or have you gotten very good at not noticing what hasn't changed? I kept that question where I kept most uncomfortable things, below the surface, just out of reach. The stomach trouble started in the 3rd year. Nothing loud, just a steady, low dissatisfaction that lived somewhere below my ribs and made its feelings known about 40 minutes after the morning pill. I mentioned it at my next appointment. The doctor wrote something on his pad and sent me home with a second prescription to address what the first prescription was causing. I remember standing at the counter holding both bottles. My daddy Earl never owned 2 pill bottles at the same time in his life. He passed at 71 from the black lung he'd earned in those Kentucky mines. But up until that last year, he was on nothing. Not one prescription. Not one. I thought about that for a moment. Then I set both bottles down and went about my morning. Eleanor said it once, just once, and in that particular quiet tone she saved for the things that actually mattered. She said, "Arthur, those pills are putting out one fire and starting another." I told her I trusted the doctor. She nodded and went back to her book. She didn't argue. She planted seeds and waited for me to water them. I've never known a more patient woman. The cost added up too. This was the mid-90s. Fixed pension income. About $30 a month going toward a medication that, as best I could measure, was keeping my hands at exactly the same level of pain they'd been at before I started. So I started keeping a small journal. That's the engineer in me. I need numbers to think clearly. And every morning I wrote down a pain level, 1 to 10. After 3 months, I averaged it out. The number hadn't moved a single point in either direction. I underlined that twice and sat with it. It was around then that my grandson Marcus came down to stay for a week. Patricia's boy. He was about 14, curious about everything in that particular way of young people who haven't yet been told which questions to stop asking. He was in the workshop with me one afternoon, watching me try to work a cabinet door with the orbital sander. And he said, "Grandpa, your hands shake when you work now. They didn't used to do that." I said, "I know." He said, "Does the medicine help?" I put the sander down and looked at my hands in the light from the window above the bench. The knuckles were swollen. They'd been swollen for 11 years. I said, "That's a good question, Marcus." He went back to whatever he was doing. I stood there in the workshop a long while after, just looking at my hands. I spent a good while writing down exactly what I learned from what came next. The remedy itself, the proportions, how to prepare it, what Eleanor's nursing journal had to say about the science underneath it, and what my father's notebook had understood about it back in 1964 without knowing the science at all. It's all in the Coleman Remedy book, the link's in the description. I wanted to write it down carefully because I almost didn't figure any of this out, and I don't want that to be somebody else's story. The thing that changed everything was not dramatic. In my experience, the things that actually change things almost never are. It was February of 2001. We'd had 2 days of hard ice up in Asheville, the kind that glazes every branch and makes the backyard look like something from a glass museum. Eleanor had a cold, and I wasn't about to leave her to run to the pharmacy. And the roads were not worth the risk anyway. I'd run out of the prescription 2 days early, miscounted, or forgot to call ahead, I don't remember which. What I remember is standing in the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning, staring at the empty orange bottle on the left side of the counter, and thinking, well, that's that for today. I waited for the pain to worsen. That's what you're trained to expect, that the pill is all that stands between you and something worse, and without it, the machinery degrades. I waited for it the way you wait for weather you know is on its way. The morning passed without incident, then another. On the third morning, something else happened instead. I was sitting at this table, at this chair, with my coffee, and my eyes went to the shelf beside the kitchen window where I keep my father's notebook. That hand-bound ledger in Earl Coleman's careful handwriting, 200 pages of what an Appalachian farmer learned from his grandmother about what grows and what heals and what the mountains have always had that the pharmacy never will. I hadn't opened it in years, too busy managing. I pulled it off the shelf. The smell of aged paper and the faint warp of the cover from decades of humidity. I sat with it a moment before I opened it. My father's hands had touched every single page. His grandmother's knowledge was in there, passed from her hands to his. I found myself thinking of him at the kitchen table in Harlan County, writing by lamplight, making sure the words were right. I opened to the J section. He had an entry, joint fever and hand stiffness, cause and treatment. 2 pages, written in 1964, in ink that had gone a little brown at the edges. 3 ingredients, fresh ginger root, turmeric root, and raw honey. A morning tea and a warm compress from the spent roots for the hands themselves. I looked up toward the ceiling. Eleanor was upstairs, still resting with her cold. And I thought about all the times she'd mentioned turmeric in passing. She'd read something about it in one of her nursing journals. I'd never asked her to go on. I looked at my father's 2 pages, and I thought about the 11 years and the $30 a month, and Marcus asking me whether the medicine helped. The ginger and turmeric were dormant under the ice in the garden, but I had dried roots in the pantry, same as always. The raw honey was on the counter, where it's been for 50 years. I did the arithmetic in my head. The whole batch was maybe $2. maybe less if you grew your own. I made the tea, sat down at this table and drank it slow, watching the ice on the back fence catch the early light, the way Eleanor always said it did. I wasn't expecting anything. I want to be clear about that. I'd been disappointed in enough things by then to have given up expecting, which is its own kind of peace. What happened in the 3 weeks that followed, I will tell you plainly and without exaggeration, because I have no interest in exaggeration and never have. The swelling in my knuckles began to go down. Not entirely, not overnight. I'm not going to tell you it was a miracle, because I am not a man who uses that word for things I can measure. But I could measure this. The morning journal that had sat fixed at the same number for 3 years of careful entries, it moved. It went from a 6 to a 4, from a 4 to a 3. My hands in the workshop stopped shaking. I went to see the doctor in April. He ran the blood work, checked the joints, asked about the exercises he'd been recommending for years. I told him I'd been drinking a tea every morning made from ginger root, turmeric, and raw honey. He wrote something in my file. We didn't spend a great deal of time on the subject. I drove home and made the tea. That evening, Eleanor came downstairs, and I told her what I'd found in her father-in-law's notebook. She sat right across from me at this table and listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with her hands folded. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Arthur, I have been waiting 8 years for you to open that book." I asked her why she hadn't just told me herself. She said, "Because then it would have been my idea." We sat a long while after that. The tea went cold between us. Outside, the early dogwood had started to open. I am not telling you to stop your medication. I want to be plain about that, because it matters more to me than any of what else I've said today. What goes into your body is a conversation between you and the doctor you trust. I'm only a man who spent 11 years and a fair amount of money to stay exactly where I started, and then found something in a handwritten notebook from 1964 that cost $2 and moved the needle. I've written all of it down, the exact remedy, the measurements, how I prepare it in the morning before the garden, what to look for, what to be patient about, what Eleanor's nursing journal said was happening physiologically when you give your joints what the ginger and turmeric carry, what my father's grandmother understood about it without knowing any of those words. All of it is in the Coleman Remedy book. It's not a medical textbook. I'm not a doctor, and I never pretended to be. It's a record, the same kind of record my father kept, the same kind Eleanor kept, the kind you write because you don't want what you learned to disappear when you do. The link is in the description. Read it the way you'd read something a neighbor wrote out by hand and left on your table, because that is exactly what it is. Nobody's going to sell you this in a bottle, not for $2 anyway. My daddy used to say, the most expensive cure is the one somebody sells you. He wrote it on the first page of his notebook, not as a piece of advice, just as a fact he'd arrived at through observation. 84 years into this life, I've got very little to argue with on that page. There is something in your pantry right now that has been in pantries a long time before there were pharmacies to compete with. The knowing was always closer than the prescription pad. That's all I came here to tell you today. Make of it what you will.